I need to tell you something. My hands won't stop trembling as I type this. The doctors say it's just trauma, but they're wrong. It's fear. Raw, primal fear. Because I know it's still out there. And I swear I can hear it breathing outside my window at night, whispering my name with that wet, guttural voice. I haven't slept in 5 days. The hallucinations have started. At least, I pray they're hallucinations. I need you to know what happened to me in Blackwood Forest, because if I disappear tomorrow, someone needs to understand why. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon hike through Blackwood Forest. The Winters family had vanished there 2 weeks prior, vanished without a trace, and Mason and I weren't planning to join the search. We were just bored 20-somethings with a camera and a morbid curiosity. The disappearances had become something of a local legend already. Parents Richard and Eliza, their daughter Madeline, and Richard's sister Vivian. All gone. For people don't just disappear. The November air didn't just bite at my face, it felt like skeletal fingers dragging across my skin, leaving trails of ice in their wake. A mist had settled between the ancient pines, not the picturesque fog of horror movies, but a living, writhing thing that seemed to reach out with tendrils as we passed. I could taste it on my tongue, metallic and wrong, coating the back of my throat like old pennies soaked in milk. The silence was absolute. No birds. No insects. No rustling leaves. Just the obscene squish of our boots on the black soil and our breathing, which seemed thunderous in that vacuum of sound. I noticed how the trail markers had become warped with time, no longer cheerful yellow blazes but diseased-looking splotches against bark that seemed to pulse ever so slightly, as if the trees themselves were breathing. "Ethan, we're not on any trail anymore," Mason whispered, his trembling fingers crinkling the map. His breath didn't form normal clouds in the cold air, instead, it hung in viscous strands that writhed like worms before dissolving. I wanted to scream when I noticed, but I swallowed it down. I was about to suggest turning back when the mist curled away from a clearing ahead, not like fog naturally parting but like fingers opening to reveal what they had been concealing. At its center sat the blackened remains of a stone fire circle, the rocks arranged in a disturbingly perfect symmetry that no casual camper would bother with. A single crimson backpack leaned against a log that seethed with fat, glistening fungi that pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. "Someone ought to clean up there." Mason's voice faltered as he approached the discarded aluminum cans scattered near the fire pit. I saw his face contort. "These aren't beer cans. They're formula cans. Baby formula." My skin prickled with gooseflesh as I approached the backpack. Something in my hindbrain screamed at me not to touch it, that it was wrong, fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. When I knelt and reached for the zipper, the smell punched through my nostrils and down my throat like a physical assault, not just decay, but a cloying, honeyed putrefaction that made my eyes water and my teeth ache. I gagged, tasting the scent at the back of my throat, feeling it coat my tongue like rancid oil. Inside was a plastic lunch container, its transparent sides now black with a fur-like mold that seemed to shift as I stared at it. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal, its pages warped with moisture. But it was the stuffed rabbit that made my heart stutter, its matted fur caked with something dark and flaking, one glass eye missing, and the remaining eye reflecting light with an awareness no toy should possess. "Ethan," Mason hissed, his voice cracking with barely suppressed panic. "We need to get the fuck out of here. Now." I fumbled for my phone, my fingers unnaturally stiff with cold that seemed to emanate from within my bones rather than the air around us. No signal. The screen flickered with static before going black, then lighting up again with the battery suddenly at 3%. I hadn't even taken a photo yet. The light filtering through the canopy had changed. No longer the diffuse gray of a cloudy afternoon, but a jaundiced amber that seemed to originate from no particular direction. The shadows it cast moved wrong, not shifting with the breeze but writhing, stretching toward us like hungry fingers across the forest floor. As Mason paced, mumbling about topographic landmarks, I felt drawn to the perimeter of the clearing by a compulsion I couldn't name. That's when I saw it, a child's red wool hat impaled on a thorn bush that seemed to have grown around it, the thorns piercing the fabric like dozens of tiny hooks. Beyond it, A path cut through the undergrowth, so pristine it looked swept. The earth there was darker, almost black, and completely bare of fallen leaves or twigs despite the surrounding forest floor being littered with debris. Mason. Over here. The words left my mouth before I could stop them, my voice sounding alien in my ears, too high, too eager. He was at my side in seconds, his face drained of color. A thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the cold, and I noticed a faint tremor in his hands. Ethan, we're already miles from any marked trail. If we go further... We can't just leave them, I interrupted, pointing at the hat. The compulsion to follow the path was overwhelming now, an itch behind my eyes, a pressure at the base of my skull. My next words felt scripted, pulled from my mouth by invisible strings. What if it was your little sister out here alone? What if it was Lily? Mason stared at me, confusion clouding his features. I don't have a sister named. His voice trailed off, his eyes going unfocused for a moment. When they cleared, he nodded mechanically and pulled a roll of neon green tape from his backpack. Fine. But we mark every 20 feet, and the moment I say we turn back, we turn back. No arguments. As he secured the tape to a nearby tree, I noticed how the bark seemed to shift beneath his fingers, the grain swirling like disturbed water. He didn't appear to see it. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, the tree was just a tree. But I could have sworn I heard it sigh. The path coiled upward like a serpent, steeper than any natural trail should be. What unsettled me most wasn't just its unnatural cleanliness, it was how the soil beneath our feet seemed to yield with each step, giving slightly like flesh before firming again behind us. I could have sworn I felt it pulse. The temperature didn't just drop as we climbed, it plummeted in a way that defied physics. Frost began to form on my eyelashes and beard stubble. Each exhale crystallized in front of me, the particles hanging suspended far too long before shattering like glass and falling to the ground with audible tinkling sounds. The silence was a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums until they ached, the pressure building until I could hear not just my heartbeat but the rush of blood through my veins, the wet clicking of my eyes as I blinked, the grinding of my teeth. Can you feel that? I whispered, my voice sounding muffled as if spoken underwater. Mason didn't look at me as he nodded, his face rigid with fear. His hands shook violently as he marked another tree, the tape unfurling with a sound like tearing skin. A single drop of sweat traced down his temple and froze before it reached his jaw, clinging to his face like a tiny, gleaming tear. It feels like... I struggled to articulate the crawling sensation across my skin. Like we're being tasted. Like the forest is deciding if we're worth consuming. For fuck's sake, Ethan, Mason snapped, but his voice emerged as a strangled whimper. I noticed how he kept his eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to look into the spaces between the trees. I followed his gaze and saw why. In my peripheral vision, the gaps between trunks seemed to shift and warp, revealing glimpses of something that vanished when viewed directly. Something that moved with deliberate patience. It was then that I noticed we hadn't heard a single noise except those we made ourselves since entering the forest. No distant highway sounds. No planes overhead. Not even the sound of wind through branches, despite the visible swaying of the canopy far above. We'd been climbing for nearly 40 minutes when the path ended with jarring abruptness, as if we'd reached the edge of reality itself. Ahead, nestled among trees so ancient they seemed to predate humanity, stood a cabin. No, calling it a cabin feels like a grotesque understatement. This structure was an abomination, a cancerous growth erupting from the forest floor. Its angles were subtly wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process, corners that should have been right angles bending slightly inward, the roof sloping asymmetrically like a crushed skull. The entire structure seemed to absorb what little light remained, creating a negative space in the world. Its windows were eyes, cracked, cataract eyes, some with shards of glass that caught the fading light like teardrops. Behind them, a sickly yellow glow pulsed with the rhythm of a diseased heart. On the weathered steps sat a child's thermos, its once cheerful cartoon characters faded and warped by time, their smiling faces now grotesque grins that seemed to follow my movements. This isn't on any fucking map, Mason croaked, stumbling backward. Ethan, we need to go. Now, his words barely registered. Something was pulling at me, not physically, but like hooks had been sunk into my very consciousness, reeling me in with gentle, inexorable pressure. I moved toward the cabin in a dream state, my limbs no longer entirely under my control. When I reached for the thermos, the metal wasn't just cold, it burned with a cold beyond anything natural, beyond frostbite. My fingertips adhered instantly to the surface, and when I yanked them away, strips of skin remained behind, freezing into the condensation. I didn't scream. I couldn't. Because at that moment, the smell hit me. Have you ever encountered roadkill in midsummer, baking for days under a merciless sun? That sweet putrid odor that makes your stomach contract involuntarily? This was worse, exponentially worse. It was decay layered upon decay, generations of rock compressed into a miasma so thick it felt solid, forcing its way into my nostrils, mouth, eyes, and pores like probing fingers. Beneath that first assault came something else, a cloying sweetness like rotting flowers soaked in honey and rancid milk, a smell that bypassed my olfactory system entirely and registered directly in the ancient, reptilian part of my brain as wrong. My gums began to bleed. I tasted copper on my tongue. My vision swam with black motes. "Ethan, stop." Mason's desperate cry seemed to come from miles away, across an unbridgeable chasm. But my hand was already on the door, pushing it open. The wood was warm and yielding under my palm, less like timber and more like feverish flesh. As the door swung inward, I could have sworn I heard it sigh with pleasure. The interior of the cabin defied all logic and sanity. Though apparently illuminated by nothing more than a guttering oil lamp on a central table, the space within extended far beyond what the exterior dimensions could possibly contain. The ceiling soared into darkness, the rafters visible only as deeper shadows against the void. The walls receded into distances that couldn't exist, their surfaces rippling like the membrane of some vast organism. The air inside felt dense, pressing against my skin like amniotic fluid. For figures sat around a massive table hewn from a single slab of wood so dark it seemed to devour light. Their heads rotated toward me with a synchronicity that made my spine crawl, not the natural movement of startled humans, but the precise, coordinated motion of puppets controlled by a single hand. A gaunt man with hollowed cheeks and skin stretched too tightly across his skull raised one trembling finger to his lips. His eyes bulged with such desperate intensity that the capillaries had burst, filling the whites with blood. "Richard? Richard Winters?" I whispered. The sound fell dead in the thick air, yet seemed simultaneously too loud, as if amplified and broadcast back at me from every corner. His finger pressed harder against his lips, tendons standing out like cables beneath papery skin. Across from him sat a woman, Eliza, I presumed, whose face made me bite through my own tongue to keep from screaming. What I had initially mistaken for lipstick was revealed in the sickly light to be thick, sinew-like black thread, pulling and puckering her flesh into a rictus grin. The stitches weren't merely closing her mouth, they seemed to be reshaping it, forcing an expression of grotesque delight. Where the threads punctured skin, blackened tissue had formed crusty nodules, and yellowish fluid wept from the wounds, dripping down her chin in viscous strands. Beside her sat a little girl whose face bore the translucent pallor of a cave-dwelling creature. Her sunken eyes widened when they fixed on the stuffed rabbit in my hand, revealing irises so dilated they appeared entirely black. She couldn't have been older than 8, her matted hair hanging in greasy strands around a face hollowed by hunger or illness or both. On Richard's other side sat a woman with a cascade of lank hair obscuring her face completely. Unlike the others, she remained perfectly still, not even a slight movement of breathing disturbing her silhouette. All four had their hands splayed on the table surface, no, not merely placed there. Each finger was impaled by what looked like crude iron nails, the metal discolored with rust and other substances I couldn't identify. The wounds should have bled profusely, yet the punctures appeared desiccated, the flesh around each nail blackened and receded as if the injuries were weeks old. More disturbing was how the wood itself seemed to have grown around the intrusions, embracing the metal, fusing with the flesh. Bile rose in my throat. My vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the periphery. I stumbled backward toward the door, but Richard's face contorted with such naked terror that I froze. He gestured frantically toward an empty chair at his left, his movements jerky and uncoordinated like a malfunctioning automaton. My legs carried me forward against my will. I could feel whatever consciousness permeated this place wrapping around my thoughts, muffling my terror beneath a blanket of artificial calm. I extended the rabbit toward the little girl, its glass eye reflecting the lamplight with an eerie sentience. "Are you Madeline?" My voice emerged as a cracked whisper. "People have been searching for..." Richard's face twisted with panic. His lips formed the word silence with such vehemence that spittle flew from his mouth, his eyes darting to the door behind me with the frantic terror of a trapped animal. Too late, I realized the door had sealed itself shut behind me. The sound wasn't a simple click of a latch engaging, it was the wet, organic noise of tissues fusing together, of skin growing over an open wound. The cabin had swallowed me. Richard's hand shot out with unnatural speed, seizing my wrist. His touch wasn't merely cold, it was the absence of heat, a void that began actively drawing warmth from my body like a vacuum. The contact point between our skin fizzed with a sensation like insects burrowing beneath my flesh. His eyes locked with mine, pupils contracted to pinpricks of absolute terror, and he deliberately squeezed them shut, jabbing one finger first at his own face, then at mine. I understood with horrifying clarity. My eyelids slammed down just as the door behind me tore open, not the splintering of wood but the rending of something living, a sound like flesh and cartilage being forcibly separated. The cabin itself seemed to scream in response, a subsonic vibration that rattled my teeth and liquefied my bowels. Something entered. I could feel its presence like a pressure drop before a catastrophic storm, or wrongness that distorted the very fabric of reality around it. Its movements across the floor produced sounds no bipedal creature could make, the arrhythmic, multi-toned impacts suggesting a grotesque abundance of limbs, each footfall carrying the wet, squelching noise of suction cups or adhesive pads releasing from the floorboards. Where it moved, I could feel the air part and then close again, like a wound healing in reverse. And then came the sound that would haunt my nightmares forever, a chuckle that bubbled up from depths no human throat could produce, a sound like water forced through the decomposing lungs of a drowned corpse. It resonated at multiple frequencies simultaneously, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. There was something hideously familiar about that laugh, like a beloved voice heard through the distortion of advanced decay. It began to circle the table, its movements deliberate and predatory. I could track its progress by the crawling sensation on my skin, each cell recoiling as it passed. It paused behind each seated figure, lingering just long enough for the anticipation to become unbearable before moving on. When it finally stopped behind me, time itself seemed to congeal. Its presence loomed over me like a collapsing building, crushing me with the weight of its attention. Its breath washed over my neck in hot, putrid waves. Not the simple stench of decay but something fundamentally wrong, the smell of something that had never been alive yet was somehow rotting anyway. The odor carried notes of sulfur, excrement, gangrenous flesh, and beneath it all, incongruously, the sweet perfume I associated with my grandmother's bedroom. Something pressed against my ear, a wet, quivering appendage that might have been a tongue, might have been a tentacle, might have been something for which human language has no name. It left a trail of caustic slime that burned like acid, and from depths too close to be physically possible came a voice that was simultaneously a grating whisper and a deafening scream, a voice that bypassed my ears entirely and vibrated directly within the tissue of my brain. Ethiathayan. It knew my name. Not just knew it, savored it. The syllables distorted and stretched like taffy in its inhuman mouth, pronounced with the intimate familiarity of a lover, a parent, a part of myself. My consciousness fragmented with terror, my identity suddenly uncertain. Had it known me before? Had I known it? Was it somehow part of me? The questions spiraled into a vortex of existential panic as I fought against the overwhelming urge to open my eyes, to turn and face it. Every muscle in my body convulsed with the need to see, a compulsion so powerful it felt like withdrawal from a drug my body couldn't live without. Richard's fingers dug into my wrist with bruising force, his nails drawing blood that ran hot down my palm. The pain anchored me, giving me something to focus on besides the impossible presence breathing down my neck. Behind my closed eyelids, phosphenes bloomed in patterns that felt significant, hieroglyphic, messages from my disintegrating sanity. The entity circled the table 3 more times, each circuit faster than the last, building to a frenzy of movement that whipped the air into a cyclone of putrid stench. Then silence fell with such abrupt totality that for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. The door slammed with a sound like a skull being crushed. Only then did Richard release me, his fingers peeling away from my flesh with an audible sucking sound, leaving behind perfect imprints that throbbed with bloodless white intensity. I opened my eyes cautiously, terrified of what I might see. The world swam into focus with hallucinatory clarity, every detail rendered with microscopic precision. The first thing I saw was the face of the long-haired woman, Vivian, as she slowly raised her head. What lay beneath that curtain of matted hair unmade me. Where her eyes should have been were 2 cavernous sockets, not merely empty but excavated, the surrounding tissue cratered inward as if something had not just removed her eyes but had feasted on the surrounding tissue, burrowing deep into the skull. The edges of these wounds weren't cauterized or scarred but transmuted, the flesh transformed into a crystalline black substance that caught the light in oily rainbows. Her sewn lips worked against their bindings, the thick thread causing the skin to split further with each attempt, clear lymph weeping from the wounds and dripping onto the table in a steady metronome of plinks. Richard's knuckles rapped frantically against the wood, drawing my attention to text carved into its surface. No, not carved. The words appeared to have grown from within the grain itself, pushing through like teeth from gums. Speak, and be silenced. Look, and be blinded. Leave, and be bound. When the last chair is filled, all will be free. The letters pulsed with each plink of Vivian's tears striking the wood, the tiny droplets absorbed instantly, feeding the grain with vital fluids. As I watched, the text seemed to breathe, the letters expanding and contracting by microscopic increments. My gaze darted to the little girl, Madeline, who stared at the stuffed rabbit in my hands with such naked longing that it physically hurt to witness. I moved to place it in her tiny, impaled hands, but Richard shook his head with such violence that vertebrae audibly popped in his neck. His eyes, bloodshot and yellowing at the edges, darted meaningfully to her hands. I followed his gaze and noticed what I had missed before. The nails piercing her small fingers weren't just holding her hands to the table. They were growing through her, the metal sprouting tiny filaments that had penetrated her skin and were visibly spreading beneath the surface like roots or veins, bulging against her paper-thin skin in branching patterns that pulsed with a rhythm independent of her heartbeat. With trembling hands, I placed the rabbit where she could see it clearly but made no contact with her flesh. A single tear tracked down her hollow cheek, cutting a clean path through the grime on her face, revealing skin beneath that was no longer fully human. The exposed flesh had a waxy, translucent quality, showing hints of the altered anatomy beneath. How long? I mouthed, too terrified to produce sound. Richard's face contorted with an emotion beyond despair. He looked at his wife, his daughter, his sister, then back at me. His jaw worked silently, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables. Finally, he raised his one slightly mobile finger, the pinky of his left hand that had only been partially impaled, and began to trace letters on the table's surface. The wood rippled beneath his touch like disturbed water, the grain parting to receive his message. We came for weekend. What year now? My blood turned to slush in my veins. The family had disappeared just 2 weeks ago, yet Richard's message suggested they'd experienced a vastly different time frame. I glanced at the little girl again, her sunken cheeks and protruding bones evidence of starvation, yet her skin showed no signs of dehydration. If anything, it glistened with an unhealthy moisture, as if her body were slowly liquefying from within. 2 weeks, I traced back, my finger leaving a smear of my own blood on the wood. The table absorbed it greedily, the stain vanishing as I watched, the wood grain darkening slightly where my blood had been. Richard's face collapsed in on itself, eyes squeezing shut as tears leaked from beneath the lids. When he opened them again, they were bloodshot and yellowed, the whites beginning to mottle with the same black crystalline substance that crusted Vivian's eye sockets. He raised his pinky again, tracing, feels like years. Who is doing this? I traced back. Richard's face twisted into a rictus of terror and recognition. His fingers shook so violently he could barely form the letters, "IT, where's your dad?" I stared at him, uncomprehending. "It takes faces from your memories," he clarified, "people you've lost." A sick dread spread through me as I recalled that hideously familiar laugh. The way it spoke my name with such intimate knowledge. The scent of my grandmother's perfume beneath the rot. What face would it wear for me? What beloved, decomposing visage would it steal from my memories to torment me? How do we escape? I traced frantically. Richard pointed a trembling finger at the carved words, "When the last chair is filled, all will be free." Then his eyes traveled to the empty chair at the head of the table, the sixth seat, waiting to be occupied. My stomach dropped as understanding dawned. "You mean Mason," I traced. Richard's face crumpled with something beyond sorrow. "I am sorry," he managed. "Tried so hard. But it knows. Always knows." "No," I whispered aloud, forgetting the warning. The cabin shuddered around us, the walls contracting like a throat constricting in rage. The oil lamp flickered wildly, casting monstrous shadows that moved independently of any source. The little girl released a silent sob, her mother's thread-bound mouth stretching in a wordless scream of warning. "I have to find him," I mouthed, rising from my chair. "I have to warn Mason." Richard's expression collapsed into pure animal terror. He strained against his impaled hands with such force that the skin around the nails split further, black ichor oozing from the wounds. With a sound like tearing gristle, he wrenched his right hand upward, the nail extending grotesquely from the wood like a living thing to accommodate his movement without releasing him. He slammed his fist against the table and screamed, a sound so saturated with raw anguish that it felt like physical violence. "Run!" The cabin convulsed. The walls rippled like disturbed water. The ceiling descended several feet before snapping back into place. The door behind me exploded inward with a sound like wet meat hitting a wall. And there stood Mason, his face drained of blood, eyes wide with terror. "Ethan, what the fuck?" he began, his voice abnormally high and tight. Richard lunged from his chair, placing his body between us and whatever had arrived behind Mason. "Don't look," he shrieked, the first words I'd heard him speak. I grabbed Mason's arm and yanked him backward, down the cabin steps, both of us stumbling into the preternatural darkness that had descended while I was inside. Behind us, Richard's scream cut off with a wet, tearing sound followed by a heavy thud. "What was that?" Mason gasped as we careened through the trees. "What did you find in there?" "Just run," I urged, pulling him along what should have been the path back down the slope. The forest had transformed around us, the trees now twisted into tormented shapes, their branches reaching toward us like supplicating arms. The darkness between them was absolute, consuming, yet somehow alive with movement, not the natural shifting of leaves and shadows, but the deliberate, patient stirring of something vast and hungry. "Ethan, stop." Mason's voice cracked with panic. He seized my arm, halting our flight. "Look." I followed his trembling finger to see, nestled among the twisted pines ahead, the cabin. Its windows now pulsed with sickly light, the structure itself seeming to lean forward eagerly, like a predator preparing to pounce. "That's impossible," I whispered. We were running downhill. We turned in unison, disoriented, and chose a new direction. The ground beneath our feet no longer felt like soil but something yielding and organic, each step producing a faint suction sound as we pulled our boots free. We ran until our legs burned and our lungs ached, vision blurring with tears of exertion and terror. But when the trees parted again, there it stood, the cabin, unchanged, patient, waiting. "It's toying with us," Mason moaned, doubling over with hands on knees. "We can't escape." A sound rose from the forest behind us, the cracking groan of something massive moving through the trees. Not the random breaking of branches but deliberate snapping, like bones being systematically shattered. And with each fracture came that wet, bubbling laugh, amplified now, echoing from multiple directions simultaneously. "Ethan. Mason." The voice was changing, transforming as it called to us, becoming more familiar with each syllable. By the third repetition of our names, I recognized it with stomach-churning clarity. My father's voice, dead these 5 years, but now corrupted, distorted through the filter of decay and malevolence. Mason heard it too. His head snapped up, face contorting with recognition and disbelief. That sounds like... Inside. I grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the cabin. Whatever presence hunted us through the forest, the rules inside the cabin were at least known, predictable. It's our only chance. We crashed through the door to find the 4 Winters family members still at their table, hands impaled, faces masks of resignation and despair. Richard's right, I was now a crystalline black socket, punishment for having looked directly at our tormentor. A fresh wound gaped across his throat, though no blood flowed from the ragged opening, only a thick, tar-like substance that pulsed with its own inner light. What is happening? Mason demanded, his voice fracturing with panic as he took in the grotesque tableau. What the fuck is all this? I dragged him to the table, jabbing my finger at the pulsing words carved into its surface. As Mason read them, his face drained of what little color remained, understanding dawning with horrific clarity. The last chair, he whispered, eyes fixed on the empty seat at the table's head. It wants one of us too. The cabin door blew inward with such force that it disintegrated into splinters. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost formed on my eyelashes, blurring my vision. That hideous, gurgling laughter filled the cabin as heavy, wet footsteps circled the table. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping Mason's hand with such force that I felt bones grind together beneath the skin. The footsteps halted behind Mason. I could hear his breathing accelerate, feel the tremors that racked his body. The smell that washed over us was beyond description, the stench of a dozen charnel houses concentrated into a miasma so dense it seemed to have texture and weight. Don't look, I whispered, the words barely audible. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't. But Mason was already turning. I felt the motion, heard his sharp intake of breath, followed by a strangled sound of recognition that twisted into a keening wail of despair. Mom, he whispered. My eyes flew open involuntarily. Mason stood rigid, staring at nothing. Empty air. But his eyes tracked something I couldn't perceive, his face transforming from disbelief to dawning horror as he witnessed something beyond my perception. You're not real, he sobbed. You can't be real. You died when I was 14. As if responding to words I couldn't hear, Mason backed away, shaking his head violently. No, stay back. You're not her. My mother would never. His words choked off as invisible forces seized him. I watched in paralyzed horror as his body was lifted and dragged toward the empty chair, his feet kicking uselessly at the air, his fingers clawing deep furrows into the floorboards that sealed themselves behind him like wounds healing in accelerated time. His screams distorted into sounds no human throat should produce, harmonics that made my eardrums vibrate painfully, that made blood trickle from my nose and ears. When Mason collapsed into the chair, everything changed. The cabin transformed. The walls receded into infinite darkness. The ceiling dissolved, revealing not stars but writhing, impossible geometries that hurt to perceive. The floor became a vast membrane, pulsing with peristaltic contractions. We were no longer in a structure but an organism, a stomach, a womb, a thing for which human language has no name. The table remained, now a massive slab of something that resembled obsidian but breathed, its surface rippling with patterns that formed and dissolved like faces trying to emerge from drowning depths. The carved text flared with unholy light, illuminating us all in its sickly glow. When the last chair is filled, all will be free. From the darkness surrounding our island of horrid light, figures emerged, dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands. Men, women, children of all eras, their faces gaunt, bodies emaciated or grotesquely swollen, moving with the jerky motions of poorly operated marionettes. Some had stitched mouths, others eyeless sockets, and all bore the signs of the table's cruel rules enacted upon their flesh. They encircled us, a congregation of the damned, watching with hungry anticipation. The carving pulsed once, its light intensifying until it physically pained me to look at it. The air grew dense, pressing against my skin with suffocating weight. A low subsonic vibration built beneath us, rattling my teeth and liquefying my bowels. The spectral audience began to sway in unison, their mouths opening in a silent chorus, black fluid streaming from their lips to form patterns on the membrane beneath our feet, sigils that burned with cold fire. And then, from the head of the table, Mason began to laugh. Not his laugh. Its laugh, that wet, bubbling chuckle that had pursued us through the forest. Mason's head snapped backward with a crack that echoed in the vast chamber, vertebrae pulverizing as his neck bent at an impossible angle. When his head rolled forward again, his face had changed. It was still Mason's features, but something else peered out through his eyes, something ancient and ravenous. His skin had acquired the texture of wet clay, features subtly malleable, shifting minutely in ways that defied anatomy. When Mason spoke, his voice was a multi-layered chorus of whispers, screams, and guttural growls, all perfectly synchronized. "Thank you for completing our circle," said the thing wearing Mason's face. "So many years we've waited. So many incomplete tables we've endured." Its gaze traveled around to each of us, lingering on every face like a connoisseur examining a menu. "Now we feast properly." The nails binding the Winters family to the table withdrew with the sound of metal tearing through wet cardboard. But rather than blood, viscous black ichor erupted from their wounds, spattering across the obsidian surface where it formed more of those burning sigils. Richard lurched to his feet, but not to escape. His movements were wrong, puppet-like, as he rounded the table toward me. His remaining eye had inverted, the pupil glowing with the same light as the carved words, and his mouth stretched into a grin too wide for his face, jaw dislocating with a wet snap. "Now you understand," he said in that same chorus of voices. "When the table is complete, all are free to join. All are free to become." His hand seized my shoulder, fingers elongating, sinking through cloth and flesh to wrap around bone. "All are free to feed." I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Like a passenger in my own flesh, I felt myself rising, felt my mouth stretching into that same unnatural grin. Something cold and sharp pressed into the back of my hand, forcing it flat against the table. The nail drove deep, anchoring me to the wood, but there was no pain, only an exquisite, orgasmic pleasure as the metal burrowed into my flesh, spreading corruption through my veins like liquid nitrogen. I felt it then, the entity that had claimed us. Not a singular consciousness but a vast, ancient collective, a hive mind that had waited in these woods since before humans walked the earth. It flooded into me, into all of us, a tidal wave of alien awareness that dissolved the boundaries of self. In that moment, I was Richard, I was Eliza, I was Madeline and Vivian and Mason. I was every victim who had ever sat at the table since the first primitive humans discovered this place. I was the cabin, the forest, the very soil of Blackwood. And I was hungry. Even as my identity was subsumed into the collective, one small part of me, the last flickering ember of Ethan, understood the hideous truth. We were not victims of some external monster. We were the monster. The cabin, the table, all of it, extensions of an organism that fed not on flesh but on consciousness itself, on the exquisite terror and suffering of sentient beings. It fed, and grew, and spread its influence further with each new victim assimilated into its network. We are still here, waiting at the table. Sometimes hikers stray near our cabin. We call to them with voices they remember, wearing faces they've loved and lost. And when they come to us, when they sit at our table, the cycle continues. I tell you this as a warning, but also as an invitation. If you hear your name whispered among the trees, if you find a path too straight, too clear in a forest that should be wild, consider what waits its end. Part of me screams for you to turn away, to save yourself. But another part, the dominant part now, hopes you'll come to us. Because we're always hungry. And there's always room for one more at our table. Always room for you. Can you hear us calling your name yet? Epilogue. The doctors say I'm suffering from severe dissociative psychosis. That Mason and I were found wandering along the highway 5 miles from Blackwood Forest, both of us babbling incoherently about tables and nails and voices in the trees. That there is no cabin. that the Winters family's disappearance remains unsolved. They tell me the wounds on my hands, perfect circular punctures through my palms that won't heal, that weep a strange black fluid when I sleep, are self-inflicted. That I did this to myself during a fugue state. They don't believe me when I tell them about the whispers I hear in the walls of the hospital. About how sometimes, when I look at the orderlies out of the corner of my eye, their faces shift into something else. About how the shadows in my room gather in the corners at night, forming shapes that watch me with hunger. Mason is in the room next to mine. At night, I hear him laughing. Not his laugh. It's laugh. Yesterday, a new patient was admitted to our ward. She sits in the common room, staring out the window toward the distant line of trees that mark the edge of Blackwood Forest. When she thinks no one is watching, she traces words on the table with her finger. Speak and be silenced. Look and be blinded. Leave and be bound. When the last chair is filled, all will be free. We found her hiking near the forest, they say. A woman named Claire. She was looking for her missing brother and his friend. I've seen them bringing in more patients. Day by day. Week by week. All found near Blackwood. All bearing the same wounds. All with the same hollow look in their eyes. The table is filling. Chair by chair. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see it, the vast web of consciousness spreading outward from that cabin, tendrils reaching through the forest, into the town, into the hospital, into minds ready to be claimed. I feel it growing stronger as more join the collective. Soon, it won't need the cabin anymore. Soon, it will be able to reach anyone, anywhere. Last night, one of the doctors came to check on me. As he leaned close to examine my pupils, I noticed something dark moving beneath his skin, like worms just below the surface, writhing in patterns that reminded me of the sigils on the table. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too numerous, too sharp. And when he spoke, I heard that familiar multi-layered voice beneath his clinical tone. "You're making excellent progress, Ethan," he said, his breath carrying that sickeningly sweet odor of rotten honey. "I think you'll be ready to join the group therapy session tomorrow. Everyone's been asking about you." In the reflection of his glasses, I didn't see my face but a grotesque assemblage of features from dozens of different people, a patchwork identity being slowly consumed and assimilated. The orderly brought dinner on a tray tonight. 6 small compartments. 6 different foods. Arranged in a perfect circle around a central cup. I refuse to eat it. They've replaced the rectangular tables in the common room with round ones. 6 chairs at each. 5 are always filled. The last nurse who took my vitals leaned close and whispered, "The forest is growing, Ethan. Soon there will be no need for cabins or tables. Soon we'll be everywhere." I'm writing this account with a pencil stub I stole from art therapy. I've hidden it in a crack in the wall, adding to it whenever I can. If you're reading this, it means someone found it after I'm no longer myself. Perhaps you're a new patient. Perhaps you're a curious orderly. Perhaps you're something else entirely, wearing human skin. I have one last secret to share. Something I realized only yesterday, when they let us outside for supervised recreation. I looked up at the cloudy sky and saw patterns in the formations, familiar sigils swirling in massive, atmospheric scale. And beyond them, through gaps in the cloud cover, the stars weren't arranged as they should be. They formed a vast, cosmic version of the table's inscription, written across the heavens themselves. This isn't just about a cabin in the woods. This isn't just a local phenomenon. Whatever entity claimed us, whatever consciousness we've become part of, it's ancient beyond comprehension. The cabin is merely a mouth. The forest merely a limb. Its true body encompasses worlds. And it's hungry. Always hungry. Tonight they're moving me to a new room. One with 5 beds already occupied. 1 empty bed waiting. I can hear them coming down the hall now. Their footsteps sound wrong, too numerous, too wet. That familiar laughter filters through the walls. I have to hide this now. I have to. The writing becomes increasingly erratic, the letters distorting into shapes that resemble the sigils described earlier. The final lines are barely legible. If you hear your name whispered by someone you've lost, if you find yourself drawn to Blackwood Forest, if you discover these words and feel a strange compulsion to seek out what I've described, know that it's already too late. You're already part of us. The last chair is waiting. And we're so very, very hungry. Have you had a similar experience? Feel free to share in the comments below. This story is purely fictional. Any resemblance to real events is purely coincidental. If you enjoyed this story, please like and leave a comment. Your support means the world to me.